To understand why Russia wants Ukraine, you have to go back more than 1,000 years. Not because the history is complicated, though it is, but because in this particular conflict the history is not just background context. It is the actual argument. It is the justification Russia has given for mobilizing the largest land army Europe has seen since World War II. It is the reason a man in his 70s sat down in July of 2021, 9 months before the tanks rolled in, and wrote a 5,000-word essay arguing that Ukraine does not exist as a real nation. That man was Vladimir Putin. And understanding what he wrote in that essay, why he wrote it, and whether any of it is true, takes you closer to understanding this war than almost anything else you could read. Putin's essay was titled, "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians." In it, he argued that Russians and Ukrainians are not two separate peoples, but one people, sharing the same ancestry, the same language roots, the same Orthodox Christian faith, and the same spiritual homeland. He traced this unity back to Kievan Rus, the medieval state that emerged in the 9th century, and whose capital was the city of Kiev. Kievan Rus was the civilization from which modern Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians all descend. The princes of Kievan Rus, the cathedrals, the laws, the language, the very idea of a Slavic Christian civilization in the east of Europe, all of it traces back to that one city on the banks of the Dnipro River. Putin's argument was that because Kiev was the cradle of that shared civilization, Ukraine is not a foreign country. It is Russia's origin story. And by that logic, a Ukraine that turns westward, that joins European institutions, that aligns itself with NATO, is not just a neighboring state making a sovereign foreign policy choice. It is, in Putin's telling, a betrayal of a shared heritage engineered by outside forces trying to divide what history made whole. This is the emotional and ideological core of Russia's desire for Ukraine. But it is also, historians and scholars are near unanimous on this point, a profound distortion of history. Kievan Rus was not Russia. The Russian state that we know today descended primarily from the Principality of Moscow, which was a relatively minor outpost of the Kievan Rus world before the Mongol invasions of the 13th century destroyed the old order. After the Mongols, the histories of what would become Russia and what would become Ukraine diverged for centuries. Ukraine's western territories spent long periods under Polish and Lithuanian rule, absorbing different cultural and political influences. The Ukrainian Cossack tradition, the Ukrainian language, the distinctly Ukrainian forms of Orthodox practice, and folk culture. All of these developed during centuries when Moscow had little to no presence in Ukrainian life. Putin's claim that Ukrainians and Russians are one people is a little like claiming the English and the Americans are one people because they share a common ancestor. It contains a kernel of historical truth that is stretched across a vast political lie. What constitutes Ukraine today was not part of the Tsardom of Muscovy. It was incorporated into the Russian Empire only through centuries of imperial expansion and conquest, a fact that makes Russia's claim of organic unity look considerably more like a colonizer's retrospective justification. And yet, despite the historical distortion, the emotional power of this narrative inside Russia is real. The city of Kiev is genuinely revered in Russian Orthodox tradition. It was in Kiev in the late 10th century that Prince Vladimir, after whom Putin himself is named, baptized the Slavic peoples into Christianity, an event that Russians and Ukrainians both regard as foundational to their civilizations. Kiev is sometimes called the mother of Russian cities, a phrase that carries genuine spiritual weight in Russian culture. When Putin looks at a Ukraine drifting toward the West, toward the European Union, toward NATO, he is watching what he believes is not just a geopolitical shift, but a civilizational amputation. The Council on Foreign Relations has noted that many Russian politicians viewed the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the independence of Ukraine as a mistake of history and a direct threat to Russia's standing as a great power. Putin himself famously called the Soviet collapse the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And at the center of that catastrophe, in his mind, was the loss of Ukraine. But beyond identity and history, Russia's desire for Ukraine is also deeply, practically strategic. Ukraine is not just symbolically important to Russia, it is geographically critical. Ukraine is a country the size of France. It sits directly on Russia's western border, and it lies between Russia and the rest of Europe. For centuries, Russia has operated on the strategic principle that its security depends on having buffer zones between its heartland and potential adversaries. The vast plains of Eastern Europe have historically been invasion corridors. Napoleon used them. Hitler used them. Russia lost approximately 27 million people in World War II, a figure so enormous that it is almost impossible to process emotionally, and it has shaped Russian strategic thinking ever since. The possibility of a hostile military alliance sitting on Russia's doorstep, on the territory of a country Putin considers part of Russia's natural sphere, triggers a level of strategic anxiety in Moscow that Western analysts have repeatedly underestimated. The NATO expansion argument is the one Russia has leaned on most heavily in justifying the invasion to international audiences. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has an open-door policy that allows any European democracy that meets the criteria to apply for membership. After the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, many of the former Warsaw Pact countries of Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, the Baltic states, and others joined NATO. Russia watched this expansion with growing alarm, arguing that Western officials had made informal assurances in the early 1990s that NATO would not expand eastward. Western governments dispute that any such formal commitment was ever made. The documentary record supports the Western position. No binding agreement was ever signed. But the perception of broken promises, accurate or not, became a foundational grievance in Putin's worldview. When Ukraine's government, following the 2014 Maidan revolution that ousted a pro-Russian president, began moving more decisively toward NATO membership, Russia drew what it described as a red line. A Ukraine in NATO meant Western military infrastructure on Russia's border, within striking distance of Moscow and in the birthplace of Russian civilization. From Moscow's perspective, this was intolerable. From Ukraine's perspective, and from NATO's, a sovereign nation has the right to choose its own alliances, full stop. What makes this argument particularly important to understand is that it contains a genuine security concern buried inside an unacceptable political demand. Most serious security analysts, including those deeply critical of Putin, acknowledge that NATO expansion created real anxieties in Moscow, and that Western policy in the 1990s and 2000s was sometimes careless about managing those anxieties. None of this justifies the invasion of a sovereign nation. None of it excuses the documented war crimes committed by Russian forces in Ukrainian cities. But understanding the genuine security logic behind the NATO argument helps explain why the war happened without excusing that it did. Then there is the Crimea question, which reveals another dimension of why Ukraine matters so profoundly to Russia in purely military terms. Russia seized Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula in 2014, and one of the primary reasons was the Black Sea. The Black Sea is Russia's only warm-water naval access route that does not depend on passing through straits controlled by other nations during winter months. The Russian Black Sea Fleet, headquartered at Sevastopol in Crimea, has existed since the time of Catherine the Great. It is Russia's gateway to the Mediterranean, to the Middle East, to North Africa. Without Sevastopol, Russia's ability to project naval power beyond its immediate borders is dramatically reduced. Russia had maintained its Black Sea Fleet in Crimea under a lease agreement with Ukraine. But when Ukraine's government turned decisively westward after 2014, Moscow could no longer be confident that arrangement would hold. The seizure of Crimea was, among other things, the seizure of a strategic military asset that Russia believed it could not afford to lose. With a larger and more sophisticated military presence in Crimea, Russia can project power deeper into the Mediterranean and Middle East, regions where it has historically had limited influence. But perhaps the most underreported dimension of why Russia wants Ukraine is the economic one. And the numbers here are staggering enough that they deserve to be stated plainly. Ukraine sits on top of one of the most extraordinary concentrations of natural wealth anywhere in the world. The country holds 117 of the 120 most widely used minerals on Earth. It has the largest assessed reserves of uranium in Europe. It has the second largest reserves of iron ore, titanium, and manganese on the continent. It has the third largest reserves of shale gas in the world. It has proven reserves of lithium, which is the critical mineral at the heart of the global electric vehicle and battery storage revolution. It holds approximately 20% of the world's graphite reserves. Before the full-scale invasion of 2022, Ukraine's mining and metal complex contributed roughly 10% of its GDP and 33% of its total exports. The total estimated value of Ukraine's natural resource holdings, according to research cited by the Washington Post, is over $26 trillion. And Russia, through its occupation of eastern and southern Ukraine, has already seized control of resources valued at between $12.5 trillion and $15 trillion, according to estimates from Ukraine's Institute of Geological Sciences. These are not abstract figures. The Russian-occupied territories contain the bulk of Ukraine's coal reserves, which are concentrated in the east. They contain 2 of Ukraine's 4 lithium deposits. They contain significant titanium and rare earth deposits. Russia's own 2024 Minerals Development Strategy explicitly refers to completing the integration of mineral complexes from occupied Ukrainian territories into the Russian economy, naming coal, iron, manganese, rare metals, and construction materials. This is not the language of a country making defensive security calculations. This is the language of annexation and economic absorption, and the port city of Mariupol, which Russia captured and devastated in one of the war's most documented atrocities, is already being used by Russian forces to export grain, coal, and metallurgical products from the occupied territories. Russia is quite literally loading Ukraine's resources onto ships and selling them. Ukraine is also the breadbasket of Europe, a description that is not metaphorical. In the year before the invasion, Ukraine supplied 12% of global wheat, 16% of all corn, 18% of all barley, and nearly half of the world's supply of sunflower oil. Its agricultural exports totaled almost $28 billion annually, feeding developing nations across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Russia's systematic targeting of Ukrainian grain storage facilities, farm equipment, port infrastructure, and Black Sea shipping routes has not just damaged Ukraine's economy. It has contributed to food price spikes and food insecurity across the developing world, and by doing so, it has simultaneously weakened its rival and strengthened its own position as a commodity exporter, since Russia also exports many of the same agricultural products. In the months following the invasion, Russia increased its own wheat exports by 60%. There is also the question of pipelines. Ukraine's territory has for decades been a critical transit corridor for Russian natural gas flowing to European markets. The pipelines that brought Siberian gas to Germany, Austria, France, and others run through Ukrainian territory. This gave Ukraine enormous economic leverage over Russia in energy negotiations, leverage that Moscow found deeply uncomfortable. At various points, disputes over gas pricing between Russia and Ukraine led to supply disruptions that affected European consumers in the middle of winter. The desire to bypass Ukrainian pipeline infrastructure to reduce Ukraine's leverage over Russia's most important export was a persistent strategic objective in Moscow long before the tanks rolled in. The simultaneous development of the Nord Stream pipelines directly under the Baltic Sea to Germany, bypassing Ukraine entirely, was Russia's attempt to solve this problem through infrastructure rather than military force. When that approach was completed and then effectively ended by the war and the subsequent sabotage of the pipelines, the strategic calculus shifted again. What the combination of all these factors describes is not a single reason why Russia wants Ukraine, but a convergence of motivations that reinforces itself at every level. At the identity level, Putin has convinced himself and a significant portion of the Russian political class that a fully independent, Western-aligned Ukraine is an existential challenge to Russian civilization, a denial of Russia's own story of who it is and where it came from. At the strategic level, a NATO-aligned Ukraine with Western military infrastructure on its territory represents exactly the kind of security threat that Russian strategic culture has been wired to treat as intolerable for centuries. At the naval level, the Black Sea Fleet and Crimea represent a military asset Russia views as non-negotiable. And at the economic level, the resources under Ukrainian soil represent a prize of almost incomprehensible value in a world rapidly reorganizing its supply chains around critical minerals for the energy transition. A world in which whoever controls lithium, titanium, graphite, and uranium holds enormous geopolitical leverage. What none of these reasons excuse, justify, or mitigate is the reality of what the war has done to ordinary people. Millions of Ukrainians have been displaced from their homes. Entire cities have been reduced to rubble. Documented massacres in Bucha and other towns have shocked the international community. Children have been deported to Russia in what prosecutors are pursuing as crimes against humanity. The suffering has been real, immense, and ongoing. And against all of Putin's calculations, what the war has done most decisively is precisely what he claimed to want to prevent. It has forged a Ukrainian national identity stronger and more cohesive than it has ever been in modern history. The Ukrainians who Putin insisted were not really a separate people have demonstrated, at an enormous cost in blood and sacrifice, that they are exactly that, a separate people, with a separate history, a separate language they are now fiercely reclaiming, a separate future they have decided they will fight to determine for themselves. Putin once said that Russia's borders do not end anywhere. The Ukrainians have spent 3 years proving that they do.